like what the farmer in Jesus' parable is. He's got a sudden windfall that he did not expect. And he's got to figure out what to do with it. An interesting dilemma. Jesus has already told his disciples and told us many things about money. It's interesting that Jesus talks about stewardship of money a lot more than he does about all the other things that we spend so much time discussing inside and outside the church. He has told them and told us that it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle, for instance, than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And yet how many of us say, you know, I think I could do that. I'd sure like to be given the shot. Getting through the eye of a needle as a camel is kind of like that guy when you're going on I-25 and there's that guy at 90 miles an hour that's pretty sure that he can squeeze into that place between you and the car in front of you that's like half a car length. It doesn't look good, but I think I can do it. And for 400 million, I would try. That seems to be our mantra. And isn't it interesting, have you ever noticed that the sales go up as the prize go up? Whenever we get, this is like, I think, something like the 4th or 5th largest jackpot ever. The sales stay down about the same when it starts out at $40 million. How many of you think that your life would not be substantially changed, or at least your financial circumstances, if you had $40 million today? Some of you thinking, oh yeah, I'd probably go up in a tax bracket. Maybe some of you would go down, right? Greed is what Jesus talks about, but not just that. He also talks about the relationship between money and people, and how that affects the relationship between people and God. This is not a story that's unique to Luke, but Luke tells it in a little bit of different order and a little bit different way. There's an interesting segue that Luke uses for this. He does things a little bit differently than other gospel writers. You know what a segue is, right? Mm-hmm. It's that little two-wheeled vehicle that you see in the airport. And every time you see one, you think, well, I'd like to have one of those. Now, a segue is a literal movement, a literary movement from one subject to another, or one narrative to another. Luke introduces this passage, introduces this parable. It can't just come out of nowhere. It's not like that. How many of you love the old musicals, the old movie musicals? Really? Not that many? In the musicals, nobody thinks it's unusual that you're sitting in a public place and all of a sudden people break into song. And they have a well-rehearsed dance number to go along with it. Nobody thinks that's unusual. Luke thinks it's unusual that Jesus would just break out into a parable without having some provocation. So Jesus is talking to a group of people. And one of the people, we're told, pipes up and says, "Teacher, Rabbi, I'm appointing you as the judge to intervene in the disbursement of my parents' estate." What this is probably about is that custom called, the law called in that time, for the oldest son to get a double portion whenever the estate was allotted. Now, being the oldest child in my family, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Some of you may disagree, especially the women who are not actually entitled to anything under that law. So maybe this is a younger brother who wants Jesus to intervene. Maybe it's the case where the person who is the older brother is withholding what's actually entitled to the younger one. We don't know the circumstances, but it isn't outside of the realm of a rabbi's job to intervene in a state. Nowadays, we would look upon that generally to be a violation of ethical boundaries for a minister to be involved in the estate of one who's in his or her congregation. I've done it once in the ministry as long as I've been in the ministry, and that was because it was a widow of a fellow minister. And I felt obliged to do so because of my relationship with her husband. But normally we would not do that. And Jesus declines as well. Not maybe because he doesn't want to get involved, but because he's got this great story to tell and he wants to break into it. So he says, who made me the judge? Who set me up to be the judge? But it seems like he senses, at least Luke sees, that he senses some kind of other motive at work here. He thinks that this fellow is greedy for asking the question. And so he breaks into this parable, this story. And we remember a parable is not a story freshly invented by Jesus. He doesn't make these up. These are stories that are generally known to people. And Jesus usually kind of throws a curveball in there. I promised to make a baseball reference because Brad Morgan is holding on to a whole bunch of Rockies tickets for Faith Day on Sunday. And he'd like you to get one. You're welcome, Brad. Jesus throws a little curve into the parable when he tells it. And this one is no different. So he brings up the story about this fellow who hits the jackpot. He's a farmer, and his crops have produced abundantly. And so he's stuck much like whoever might eventually win the Powerball. He's got to figure out what to do with this. He's got to work it out. And so we get a little taste of his mind at work as he fills this out because he talks to himself. He talks to himself, Jesus says, and he has this conversation with himself about what he might do with this windfall. And therein lies the reason that this parable has commonly been referred to as the rich fool. Anybody see the sign outside that Lyle did so well? If you were driving by, you might wonder what that means if you weren't familiar with the parable. Even if you are familiar with the parable, you might wonder what it means, because if you're under about 40 years old, you're not familiar with the reference to a tool. It rhymes with fool, it means about the same thing. This guy is a fool not because he's rich. We should not assume that this is an example of class warfare. Jesus and Luke are not engaging in class warfare, although Luke is very careful to tell all the stories about when Jesus shows God's concern for the poor, and especially God's concern for economic justice. But the rich fool is not a fool because he's rich. He's foolish because he thinks that the money that he has, the possessions that he has, are the be-all, end-all of all that there is. He finds himself overflowing with abundance. And yet it does not occur to him to think that he may not be fully responsible for what has happened. Much the same as we see with a lot of folks today. Don't we tend to think that whenever we become successful or whenever we imagine ourselves to be successful, that somehow it's something that we have done? And we see the same thing with others in our society, in our economy, in our community. People who have become wealthy don't see themselves as being fortunate all the time. They see themselves rather as smarter and more hardworking and more able and having more ingenuity than everyone else. And somehow we are deserving of what it is that we have. There are exceptions. Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, for instance, are two billionaires who have taken it upon themselves not only to pledge the bulk of their fortunes to charity during their lifetime and also when they die, but to try to convince others similarly situated to do the same. So not all rich people are fools. But this one is foolish for a couple of reasons. One is that, as we just mentioned, he has assumed that the abundance that he has come upon is because of his own ingenuity and hard work. He's a farmer. And so maybe he thinks, maybe I had the foresight to plant at the right time. Maybe I had the ingenuity to configure the crops in a certain way. Maybe I decided to grow corn instead of soybeans this year. Whatever the reason, he assumes that this is all his own success. And that's his first foolish mistake. If you're a farmer and you're putting things in the ground and you're expecting them to come up, don't you think that a little bit is dependent on things like weather and temperature and moisture and temperature in the soil and the lack of a hailstorm in that year? My great-grandfather was a crop insurance salesman. He made a pretty decent living going into farm communities and selling crop insurance. He would in fact go to taverns on a rainy day and buy the house a couple of rounds and then sell a whole bunch of crop insurance. So maybe you think you're smarter because you bought crop insurance and it hailed, or you didn't have to spend that extra money on the premium and it didn't hail. And you take the credit for that. And you forget to give credit to the one who is in charge, or at least overseeing the weather and climate. But he's not just foolish for that reason. He's also foolish because he does not consult with anyone but himself. Notice that in the first majority of the passage that Anne read for us, this guy is not talking to anybody but himself. He's talking aloud and he's having a conversation with himself. Now, what happens when you have a conversation with yourself? Do you usually get an argument? Pardon me?
You get bad advice.
You get bad advice. Or at least you don't recognize the bad advice that you get. So he has the conversation with himself. And he says, I've come up with a plan of what I'm going to do. My problem is that I don't have enough room to store all this stuff. He's decided that he's going to keep all of this stuff. But as it is, he doesn't have the storage space. Anybody run into that problem with storage space? We did that at church. Last month, as a matter of fact, we were renting a storage unit and cleared it out and got rid of that expense. Some of you have probably done it in your households too. You pay somebody a couple of miles away to rent what's basically a garage to store the stuff that you somehow don't need in your household that you can't bear to get rid of. It's a booming industry. This guy doesn't go rent a storage space. He's going to build one. He's going to, not only is he going to build larger space, but he's going to tear down what he has and put up more space to store this abundance that has been given. Tears down a perfectly good barn to build a bigger one for a one-time win. Does that sound like good business sense? Churches do that too, by the way. Churches are also sometimes guilty of being in the search for bigger barns. We have a temporary increase in church attendance, or the community suddenly booms and grows around us, and we decide instead of maybe having a second or a third church service, what we need to do is build another building. It needs to be larger. And we go by that old abandoned Walmart, turn it into a church. Sometimes the spirit of Walmart remains in the church. So he's resolved all of this, but then it goes deeper. It goes from an intellectual discussion with himself to the point where he addresses his soul. Not just his mind, not just doing the numbers, not just hopping on his laptop and figuring out spreadsheet what it is that he can accomplish. But now he's talking to his soul, to the eternal home of his existence. He says, soul, you have done well. You have acquired abundance. Now you can put this stuff away and live off of what you have. You don't have to work anymore. You can kick back. You can relax, eat, drink, and be merry. How many of you knew that was scriptural? It's interesting how many idioms there are in our culture that people think are from the Bible that aren't. And here's one that doesn't seem like it would be, and yet it is. But it's not meant to be good advice. It's interesting how sometimes we take a scripture out of context. We say, oh, it's in the Bible. Eat, drink, and be merry. It's in the Bible. Yeah, it is, but if you read the context, it's meant to be a word of warning, not advice. So he says, I'm going to kick back and live off of what I've earned. Or as frequently happens in relating to how this story started, sometimes the next generation says, I'm going to kick back and live off of what Daddy or Grandpa earned. I don't have to work for a living. I'm born with a silver spoon in my mouth. And he's talking to his eternal soul. And he says, I have enough to live for some time. Did you get that when Ann read it? I have enough to live for some time. I can look into the future and I can say, I've got so much abundance, I've got plenty of time. See, sometimes we think that our abundance and our assets guarantee us more time on earth. And to a certain extent that might work. If you have more money, you can afford better health care. You eat better, you don't starve to death, you don't sleep out on the street like those folks that I see every morning when I drive in from Berthoud. And so yeah, you might live a little bit longer, but it's not guaranteed, is it? Millionaires and billionaires died before they're 60 all the time. It's not that unusual. And this is a point at which God will intervene. Because up to this point, this guy has been constantly talking to himself and constantly talking to his soul. And this is the point where Luke, or Jesus rather, through Luke, brings in the presence of the living God. And God says to the man, the first time, names him, not by the name his mama gave him, but the one that we all have for him. He says, fool! When God addresses you and the first thing out of God's mouth is fool. Again, it's not something we hope for. He says, fool, you've been talking to your soul, talking to yourself as if you had eternity to live off of this windfall. But here's the deal. I get to call these shots. Your bill is due today. I have breathed the breath of life into you at your birth, and you have owed me ever since. Now I'm the collector who's coming to collect what is mine. You thought you had all of this abundance built up, but guess what? You've got a bill due, and it's got interest attached. And as they say in the mob, the vig is big. Vig, by the way, is interest you pay on a loan to a loan shark, in case you didn't know that. And if you do know that, let's talk about your gambling addiction. God says your bill is due tonight. You got a big balloon payment. Not the balloons like Bob was talking about. The balloon payment that says at the end of the period you got to pay up. God says your life is due this night. Now, what about that abundance? What about those bigger barns? What about all of that grain? All that stuff that belongs to you? Who does it go to now? We've come full circle. We started out talking about an estate. Jesus and Luke have taken us around full circle. Now we're talking about an estate again, aren't we? The rich man with the abundance dies tonight. And the question becomes again, to whom does it go? God reminds the rich fool and reminds us the lesson we tend to forget, that all that we have and all that we are is a gift from God. And we should never exclude each other or God from the conversation. By law and by custom, and certainly by the faith of the people of Israel, the first thought of this man should have been how the abundance could have been shared in the community. But he doesn't talk to anybody else. He doesn't even go to a tax counter. It's all about me. And then he has this conversation without including God. Even about matters involving his eternal life, his eternal soul, he doesn't think to consult with God. And that's what makes him foolish. And that's what makes us foolish. When we make our decisions and we live our lives without consultation in community, without consultation about our eternal spirit. The one who gave it to us as a gift. He gave us stewardship over it. So the parable takes a twist. We learn a lesson. We find out maybe sometimes we're not so much different from the fool who becomes a tool. Maybe when we leave here, we recommit. Not only ourselves individually, but our church community, our congregation, to a new view of adapting our building and the other assets that God has given us to do mission in this community, in this world, to that which we are called to do. So we say, thanks be to God. Matt, what's our moment for mission this morning? Where'd he go? There he is.
Well, I'm kind of lost.
All right, you got your basket here.
I
You
got
look
my
like
basket.
Goldilocks.
Yeah. That's the only basket I could find.
Do I need to be a wolf, or is this a different story?
No, it's a different story.
All right, that's good.
Well, our moment for mission is kind of twofold. One is that this is our first food Sunday, and today's is mac and cheese. So you can give out of your abundance for First Food Sunday, and that goes to the House of Neighborly Service. And if you want to know what's coming up in the next month, you can pick one of these pink pieces of paper out there in the hallway by the fellowship hall, and you can give out of your abundance that way. Secondly, out of the Journal of Happiness Studies is a scholarly journal that reports research on about what produces joy and happiness. As they've looked more at what is more happy people and less happy people, they found out one factor that separates the two groups. One, it's not income, or attractiveness, or IQ, or career success, or financial security. What they found out that separates those two or distinguishes them is that they have a deep presence and meaningful, affirming life relationships. One of their conclusions is that happiness is best predicted by the breadth and depth of one's most meaningful relationship, one's sense of community. Happiness, they said, tends to happen in community. So as I was thinking about this, something came to mind when I was younger. When I was in grade school, the news broke out that there was a terrible accident at sea. The yacht had been lost and never to be found. They had faced that terrible storm to never return. So aboard that boat was 7 souls. And somehow, miraculously, they survived that storm and found themselves on a deserted island. story was told about the 7 souls, how very different they were, but yet they came together to help each other. There was even a song wrote about it. And excuse me, I'm not really a musician, so bear with me on that. And it goes something like this. It says, just sit back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip that started from this tropic port aboard this tiny ship. The mate was a mighty sailing man, the skipper brave and sure. 5 passengers set sail that day for a 3-hour tour. You know the rest of the story, how the weather started getting rough and the tiny ship was tossed. And not for the courage of the fearless crew, the minnow would have been lost. And who were the castaways, do you remember? Gilligan, the skipper too, Bill Muir and his wife, the movie star, the professor and Mary Ann. Where? On Gilligan's Island. There, thank you. So through all this silliness, Gilligan's Island gives us a picture of how community happens. You throw in a bunch of people together in life's stormy circumstances with little and nothing in common except for they were stranded and struggling and trying to work out their salvation. On Gilligan's Island, the Howells figured out that it wasn't about the money, and Ginger figured out that it wasn't about her or her good looks. And the skipper learned how to be a better leader. In that community of castaways, each one has learned from the other. And they learn to see the gifts that hide underneath the surface. As you may or may not be aware of, that members of our church have been promoting the Shiprock mission trip. And just like the 7 castaways from Gilligan's Island, all of them had different gifts. You may have some different gifts as well to offer. There are a couple of ways that you could help support this great mission. First is you could donate by signing up and playing in the fundraising golf tournament, or you could just simply donate monetarily. Second, you could follow God's calling on your heart and physically be the hands and feet of Christ through your gift of your time. You also have the ability to bond with other people that you may never have had the opportunity to do. Third, you can pray. Pray for peace and justice for the Navajo people, that more of them could come to know Christ. Would the deacons please come forward this time and collect our tithes and offerings?